My fiancé dumped me for his childhood friend who he promised meant nothing. I found myself at his cousin's doorstep with plane tickets to Rome and a fresh start. The moment I saw the sonogram picture fall out of Garrett's jacket pocket, I knew the last 3 years of my life had been built on quicksand. I was standing in our bedroom, about to hang up his blazer because he'd thrown it over the chair again, when this small square of glossy paper fluttered to the hardwood floor. I picked it up thinking it was a receipt, maybe from the steakhouse where he claimed he'd been having dinner with clients. Instead, I found myself staring at a grainy black and white image with the name Melody Ashworth printed at the top, dated 6 weeks ago, with measurements and medical terminology I didn't need a degree to understand. My fiancé's childhood friend, the woman he swore was like a sister to him, was pregnant. The walls of the apartment we'd picked out together started closing in while I stood there holding proof that everything I believed about my life was a carefully constructed lie. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I heard Garrett's key in the front door lock, and something inside me went completely still, like the moment before a car crash when time stretches out and you can see exactly what's about to happen, but you're powerless to stop it. I'd been dating Garrett Whitfield for 3 years when he proposed on a rooftop in Chicago, with the skyline glittering behind us, and a ring that cost more than my first car. He was a financial analyst at a prestigious firm downtown, the kind of man who wore tailored suits and remembered wine pairings and made my mother cry happy tears when I brought him home for Thanksgiving. Everyone said we were perfect together. My coworkers at the marketing agency called us relationship goals. His family welcomed me like I'd always been one of them, especially his cousin Dominic, who joked at every holiday dinner that Garrett had finally found someone who could put up with his obsession with golf statistics. I trusted Garrett completely because he gave me no reason not to, or so I thought. He was attentive and romantic and always knew exactly what to say when I was stressed about work deadlines or worried about my dad's health. Looking back, I can see the red flags I chose to ignore. The way his phone was always face down on tables, the business trips that seemed to multiply after we got engaged, the childhood friend who texted at odd hours and showed up at events I wasn't invited to. Melody Ashworth had been part of Garrett's life since they were 6 years old, growing up on the same street in a wealthy suburb where their families vacationed together and their mothers planned their futures over brunch. She was everything I wasn't, tall and blonde with a trust fund smile and the kind of effortless confidence that comes from never having to worry about money or belonging. Garrett introduced us at his company's holiday party during our first year together, and Melody looked me up and down like she was assessing a piece of furniture that didn't match the room. She made comments about inside jokes I couldn't understand and childhood memories I wasn't part of, always finding ways to remind me that she'd known Garrett longer and better than I ever could. When I mentioned to Garrett that Melody made me uncomfortable, he laughed and said I was being insecure, that Melody was practically his sister and I had nothing to worry about. He said those exact words at least a dozen times over 3 years, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too painful to consider. The first real warning sign came 8 months before I found the sonogram, during a weekend trip to visit Garrett's parents at their lake house. Melody showed up uninvited on Saturday afternoon, claiming she'd been in the area and thought she'd stop by. She spent the entire day monopolizing Garrett's attention, suggesting activities that excluded me, reminiscing about summers they'd spent at that same lake as teenagers. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. and realized Garrett wasn't in bed. I found him on the dock with Melody, their heads close together, their voices too low for me to hear. When I called out to them, they jumped apart like I'd caught them doing something wrong. Garrett said they were just talking about Melody's job troubles, that she needed a friend and he was being supportive. Melody smiled at me with something that looked almost like pity. I went back to bed and told myself I was overreacting, that jealousy was an ugly emotion and I needed to trust my fiancé. My stomach churned all night, but I swallowed the doubt and buried it somewhere deep where I wouldn't have to examine it too closely. The second warning came 4 months later when I borrowed Garrett's laptop to check my email while mine was being repaired. I wasn't snooping, not intentionally, but a notification popped up from a messaging app I didn't know he used. The preview showed Melody's name and the beginning of a message that read, "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about..." I clicked away before I could see the rest because my heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. When Garrett came home, I confronted him as calmly as I could, asking about the message without revealing exactly what I'd seen. He got angry, which should have been another red flag. He accused me of violating his privacy, of not trusting him, of being the kind of paranoid girlfriend who drove men away. He explained that Melody had been texting about an amazing concert they'd attended with a group of their childhood friends, an event he'd mentioned to me weeks ago. The explanation was plausible enough that I accepted it, apologized for doubting him, and spent the next week trying to make up for my supposed betrayal of his trust. I see now how expertly he turned his deception into my failing, how he made me the villain for noticing his lies. The third warning was impossible to explain away, though Garrett certainly tried. I ran into his colleague Priscilla Yamamoto at a coffee shop 3 months before the sonogram, and she mentioned how nice it was that Garrett was being so supportive of his girlfriend during her pregnancy. I laughed and said I wasn't pregnant, and Priscilla's face went white. She backtracked quickly, saying she must have been thinking of someone else, but the damage was done. When I asked Garrett about it that night, he sighed heavily and said Priscilla had always been a gossip who got things wrong. He explained that his coworker must have overheard him talking about Melody, who was dealing with a pregnancy scare that turned out to be nothing. He said Melody was embarrassed about it and hadn't wanted anyone to know, that Priscilla had probably assumed he was talking about me. The explanation required so many leaps of logic that I should have seen through it immediately, but I was so deep in denial by then that I grabbed onto any excuse to avoid the truth. I told myself Garrett loved me, that we were getting married, that I was being paranoid about a friendship that had lasted 20 years before I ever entered the picture. Standing in our bedroom with the sonogram in my hand, I couldn't deny the truth anymore. The measurements on the image showed a pregnancy of approximately 18 weeks, which meant Melody had been pregnant since long before Garrett's latest business trip, the one where he'd seemed distracted and distant the entire time he was home. I heard him walking through the apartment, calling my name, and I felt something shift inside me from shock to cold, focused rage. He appeared in the bedroom doorway with his usual confident smile, the one that had charmed me on our first date and every day since. Then he saw what I was holding, and the smile collapsed like a building demolition, floor by floor until nothing was left but rubble. He started talking immediately, words tumbling over each other in a rush to explain, to minimize, to somehow make this not be what it so obviously was. I stood there silent while he spoke, watching his mouth move, hearing the familiar patterns of manipulation that I'd been blind to for 3 years, and felt absolutely nothing except the cold certainty that my engagement was over. Garrett's explanation was insulting in its inadequacy. He said it was a mistake, that it only happened once, that he and Melody had been drunk at a party and things got out of control. When I pointed out that the pregnancy timing didn't match a single drunken mistake, he changed his story, admitting they'd been together a few times but swearing it meant nothing. I asked him how something could mean nothing when it resulted in a baby, and he had no answer. He reached for me, trying to hold my hands, and I stepped back so quickly I hit the dresser behind me. The look on his face when I recoiled was almost comical, like he genuinely couldn't understand why I wouldn't let him touch me after what I'd just discovered. He kept saying we could work through this, that couples survived infidelity all the time, that he loved me and wanted to marry me and Melody didn't have to change anything between us. I asked if he was planning to be involved in his child's life, and he said of course, like that was obvious. I asked how exactly that would work with him married to me, and he stared at me blankly, as if he'd never considered that his two lives might eventually collide. I called my best friend Nadia at 11 o'clock that night from the bathroom of a hotel room I'd booked in a haze of shock and adrenaline. She answered on the second ring, immediately alert despite the hour, and listened without interrupting while I told her everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said she was booking a flight and would be there by morning. I tried to tell her she didn't need to do that I could handle this alone, but my voice cracked on the word alone and she said that was exactly why she was coming. Nadia had been my roommate in college, a fierce Puerto Rican woman who worked as a labor attorney and had never trusted Garrett from the moment she met him. She'd kept her opinions mostly to herself because she valued my happiness over being right, but now she was free to say everything she'd been holding back. She told me I deserved better than a man who lied to my face for years. She told me Melody had always looked at Garrett like he belonged to her. She told me I was strong enough to survive this, even though it didn't feel that way at 3 a.m. in a hotel room that smelled like industrial cleaner. The next few days blurred together in a fog of logistics and grief. I contacted a lawyer named Richard Bellamy, who had 22 years of experience in family and civil matters, to understand my rights regarding the apartment lease and the joint accounts Garrett and I had opened together. Richard was direct and unsentimental, which was exactly what I needed. He explained that since we weren't married, separating our finances would be relatively straightforward, though getting my name off the lease would require either Garrett's cooperation or a lengthy legal process. He advised me to document everything, to screenshot any admissions Garrett made via text, and to avoid any conversations that could be characterized as me accepting his behavior or agreeing to reconcile. I followed his instructions mechanically, preserving evidence I never thought I'd need against a man I'd planned to spend my life with. The process felt clinical and strange, like I was watching someone else's relationship fall apart from a distance, unable to fully connect the legal documents with the emotional devastation underneath. Garrett's attempts to reconcile were relentless and increasingly desperate. He showed up at my hotel the first morning with flowers and apologies, standing in the lobby until security asked him to leave. He texted constantly, alternating between remorse and anger, sometimes within the same message. He called my mother and told her I was overreacting, that he'd made a mistake but we could work through it if I would just listen to him. My mother, to her credit, told him that any man who cheated on her daughter didn't deserve a second chance and hung up on him. He contacted Nadia, who sent back a single text that I never saw, but that apparently made him stop reaching out to my friends and family. He even tried to get his parents involved, having his mother call me to explain that Garrett was devastated and needed me to forgive him. I let the call go to voicemail and saved it as evidence, just in case. His inability to accept that I was done revealed a side of him I'd never seen, an entitled desperation that made me wonder what other aspects of his personality he'd hidden during our relationship. A week after I found the sonogram, I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Amara Okonkwo, a clinical psychologist with 15 years of experience in relationship trauma. I found her through a recommendation from Nadia's sister, who had seen her after her own divorce. Dr. Okonkwo's office was warm and quiet, decorated with African art and plants that somehow managed to thrive in the low light. She listened to my story without judgment, asking questions that helped me see patterns I'd been blind to while I was inside the relationship. She pointed out that Garrett's behavior, the gaslighting, the deflection, the way he turned my concerns into accusations against me, followed a classic pattern of manipulation. She explained that what I was feeling, the confusion, the self-doubt, the difficulty trusting my own perceptions, was a normal response to being deceived by someone I loved and trusted. She didn't tell me how to feel or what to do, but she gave me the tools to understand what had happened and to begin rebuilding my sense of reality. The truth about Garrett and Melody came out in pieces over the following weeks, each revelation worse than the last. I learned from his cousin Dominic, who called me apologetically 2 weeks after the breakup, that the affair had been going on for over a year, not the few drunken mistakes Garrett had claimed. Dominic said he'd suspected something was wrong when he saw Garrett and Melody leaving a restaurant together 6 months ago, but he hadn't wanted to believe it and didn't know how to tell me. He said the family was furious with Garrett, that his parents were devastated and his grandmother had threatened to remove him from her will if he didn't make things right. I appreciated Dominic's honesty, even though it hurt, and I thanked him for telling me the truth when everyone else had been keeping Garrett's secrets. He said he'd always thought I was too good for his cousin, and that he was sorry the family's silence had allowed me to be hurt for so long. His call was the first time someone from Garrett's world had acknowledged that I was the victim here, not an obstacle in Garrett's love story with his childhood friend. The financial fallout was more complicated than I'd anticipated. Richard Bellamy discovered that Garrett had been transferring money from our joint savings account into a personal account I didn't know existed, small amounts over 18 months that added up to nearly $12,000. When I confronted Garrett about this via email, following Richard's advice to document everything in writing, he claimed the money was for a surprise, that he'd been saving for our honeymoon and now the funds were just sitting there because I'd canceled our wedding. Richard didn't buy this explanation and neither did I. He helped me file a claim for the return of my portion of the missing funds, supported by bank statements showing the timing and pattern of the transfers. Garrett's lawyer, a man named Howard Cranston who seemed exhausted by his client's behavior, negotiated a settlement that returned $8,000 to me, along with a signed agreement terminating our lease and dividing our shared property. The money didn't make up for anything, but getting it back felt like reclaiming a small piece of my autonomy from someone who'd stolen so much more. 1 month after the breakup, I received an unexpected message from Melody herself. She contacted me through social media with a message that somehow managed to be both an apology and a justification, expressing regret that I'd been hurt while simultaneously explaining that she and Garrett had a connection that predated me and would outlast any temporary relationship he had with someone else. She wrote that they'd tried to fight their feelings but eventually realized they were meant to be together, that sometimes people get hurt in the process of finding true love, and that she hoped I could eventually understand and move on. I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Richard, who said it could be useful if Garrett ever tried to claim he'd been seduced or manipulated into the affair. Then I blocked Melody on every platform I could think of and felt a surge of clarity cutting through my grief. Her message wasn't an apology at all. It was a victory lap disguised as sympathy, a final reminder that she'd won and I'd lost in a competition I never knew I was participating in. The apartment was the hardest thing to deal with. I'd loved that space, a 2-bedroom in a renovated brick building with tall windows and a view of the river. Garrett and I had spent weeks picking out furniture together, arguing over paint colors, building something that felt like home. Now I had to pack up 3 years of shared life while trying to decide what was mine and what was his, what I wanted to keep and what I needed to let go. Nadia flew back to help me, taking a week off work to sort through closets and wrap dishes in newspaper. She found the engagement ring in my jewelry box and asked what I wanted to do with it. I'd been avoiding that question for weeks, unable to look at the diamond without feeling sick, but also unable to throw it away. Nadia suggested I sell it and use the money for something meaningful, a trip or a donation or anything that would transform Garrett's guilt into something positive. The idea felt right, like turning poison into medicine, so I took the ring to a jeweler who appraised it at $14,000. I put that money aside, not sure yet what I wanted to do with it, but knowing it needed to become something other than a symbol of broken promises. Dominic reached out again 6 weeks after the breakup, this time with an unexpected invitation. He was planning a trip to Rome, something he'd been putting off for years, and he wondered if I might want to join him. The invitation caught me completely off guard. I'd always gotten along well with Dominic at family events, finding him easier to talk to than most of Garrett's relatives, but we'd never been close enough to travel together. He explained in his message that he needed to get away from the family drama surrounding Garrett, that Rome had been on his list since college, and that he thought I could probably use some distance from everything too. He said there was no pressure and no strings, just two people who'd been hurt by the same situation finding some peace in a beautiful city. I read his message 3 times, trying to figure out if there was some angle I wasn't seeing, some way this could be another trap set by someone connected to Garrett. But Dominic had been nothing but honest with me since the breakup, and the idea of escaping to another continent where no one knew my name or my story was overwhelmingly appealing. I talked to Dr. Okonkwo about the trip during our next session, laying out my hesitations and asking if accepting Dominic's invitation would be healthy or just another way of avoiding my problems. She asked me thoughtful questions about what I hoped to get from the trip, what I feared might go wrong, and how I felt about spending extended time with someone from Garrett's family. I admitted that part of me worried about how it would look, the jilted ex-fiancé running off to Europe with the cheating ex's cousin. Dr. Okonkwo pointed out that I'd spent 3 years caring about how things looked instead of how things actually were, and asked if I wanted to keep living that way. She said the only person whose opinion mattered was mine, and that if the trip felt like something I needed, I should trust that instinct. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, and sometimes required changing your physical environment to shift your mental state. By the end of the session, I decided to go. I used the money from Garrett's ring to buy plane tickets and book a small hotel near the Spanish Steps, transforming his betrayal into my freedom. The week before we left, Garrett made one final attempt to stop me. He showed up at my temporary sublet, somehow having gotten the address from a mutual acquaintance, and stood on the sidewalk calling my name until I came to the window. He looked terrible, unshaven and hollow-eyed, nothing like the polished man who'd proposed to me on that rooftop in Chicago. He said he'd heard I was going to Rome with Dominic, and he couldn't believe I was doing this to him, like I was the one who'd betrayed our relationship. He said Dominic had always been jealous of him and was probably trying to steal me as some kind of revenge. He said if I got on that plane, we were really done, as if we hadn't been done since the moment I found his pregnant mistress's sonogram in his jacket pocket. I closed the window and drew the curtains, blocking out his face and his voice and the last vestiges of any sympathy I might have felt for him. An hour later, I got a text from Dominic saying Garrett had called him screaming and asking if I was okay. I told him I was fine and that I'd see him at the airport in 5 days. He sent back a single word: perfect. The flight to Rome was 11 hours of turbulence and cramped seats and terrible airline coffee, but I didn't care because with every mile that passed, I felt lighter. Dominic and I talked for most of the flight, really talked, sharing things we'd never discussed at awkward family dinners surrounded by Garrett's relatives. He told me about his divorce 3 years ago, how his ex-wife had left him for her personal trainer in a cliché so predictable it would have been funny if it hadn't destroyed his life. He told me about rebuilding himself afterward, about the therapy and the career change and the slow process of learning to trust people again. I told him about the red flags I'd ignored with Garrett, about the way his manipulation had made me doubt my own perceptions, about the strange relief I'd felt when I finally had proof I wasn't crazy. We landed in Rome as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink over ancient buildings, and I stepped off the plane feeling like a different person than the one who'd boarded in Chicago. Our hotel was tiny and charming, with creaky wooden floors and a view of terracotta rooftops from the small balcony. Dominic had booked separate rooms, making clear without awkwardness that this trip was about friendship and healing, not romance. We spent the first day wandering through the Colosseum and the Forum, marveling at ruins that had survived millennia, while my 3-year relationship had crumbled in an instant. We ate pasta at a restaurant so small it only had 4 tables, the owner treating us like family despite the language barrier. We drank wine on rooftop terraces and threw coins in the Trevi fountain, and got lost in narrow streets that all looked the same until suddenly they didn't. For the first time since finding that sonogram, I went hours without thinking about Garrett or Melody or the life I'd thought I was building. The city demanded my attention with its beauty and chaos, leaving no room for grief to take hold. On the fourth day, Dominic took me to a small jewelry shop he'd read about in a travel guide, a family business that had been making pieces by hand for generations. The shop was cluttered and dusty, filled with antique rings and bracelets and pendants that gleamed under the low light. An elderly woman emerged from behind a curtain and spoke to us in rapid Italian, which Dominic somehow understood enough to navigate. He explained that he wanted to buy something for his mother, whose birthday was coming up, and the woman showed him a selection of pearl earrings while I wandered through the displays. I found myself drawn to a simple gold band with a small sapphire, nothing flashy but quietly beautiful, the kind of ring that meant something personal rather than trying to impress anyone. The elderly woman noticed me looking and said something to Dominic, who translated that she wanted to know if I was shopping for myself. I laughed and said I was just looking, but she insisted I try it on, pressing the ring into my palm with surprising strength. The ring fit perfectly, which felt like some kind of sign even though I don't generally believe in signs. I stood there in the dusty shop with this simple band on my finger, thinking about how different it felt from the massive diamond Garrett had given me, and realized I'd never actually liked that ring. I'd worn it because it was expected, because it represented something I thought I wanted, because saying it was too big or too flashy would have seemed ungrateful. This sapphire ring was nothing like what I would have chosen 3 months ago, and that was exactly why I needed to have it. I bought it with cash, the exchange rate making it surprisingly affordable, and wore it out of the shop feeling like I'd reclaimed something Garrett had taken from me. Dominic noticed the ring and smiled but didn't say anything, which I appreciated. He had an instinct for knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. We were eating gelato by a fountain on the 6th day when Dominic told me he'd always thought Garrett was making a mistake with me. I asked what he meant, bracing for some revelation about how obvious the affair had been to everyone but me. But that's not what he said. He said Garrett was making a mistake because I was clearly the best thing that had ever happened to him, and instead of appreciating that, he'd been looking backward at Melody like the past was somehow better than the present. He said he'd watched me at family events for 3 years, noticed how I handled Garrett's difficult mother and charmed his suspicious grandmother, and made everyone feel comfortable even when tensions were high. He said I deserved someone who saw what he saw, who understood that what I offered was rare and valuable and worth protecting. His words hit me somewhere deep, in a place I'd armored over since the breakup, and I found myself crying into my pistachio gelato, while tourists walked past pretending not to notice. The last night in Rome, we had dinner at a restaurant overlooking the city, the dome of St. Peter's glowing in the distance while candles flickered on our table. Dominic raised his glass and proposed a toast to new beginnings, which would have felt cheesy from anyone else but somehow felt exactly right from him. We talked about what we wanted our lives to look like going forward, about the dreams we'd put aside for partners who didn't deserve our sacrifices, about the permission we were finally giving ourselves to want something different. I told him I was thinking about leaving my marketing job, that I'd always wanted to work in nonprofit communications but had stayed in corporate because Garrett said the money was better. He told me he was thinking about moving out of Chicago, that being surrounded by places he'd gone with his ex-wife made it hard to imagine a different future. We didn't make any promises or plans, just acknowledged that we were both standing at the same crossroads, looking at the same uncertain horizon, and somehow that shared uncertainty felt like connection. Coming back to Chicago was harder than I expected. The city felt smaller, grayer, filled with memories I couldn't escape no matter which direction I turned. Garrett had finally stopped texting, but I heard through friends that Melody had moved into his apartment and they were expecting a baby girl in 3 months. The news should have hurt more than it did, but Rome had created some kind of buffer between me and my former life, a distance that made everything seem less immediate. I went back to therapy with Dr. Okonkwo and told her about the trip, about the conversations with Dominic, about the sapphire ring and the gelato, and the feeling of possibility that had started growing somewhere beneath my grief. She said travel wasn't a cure for trauma, but it could be a catalyst for change, and asked what I wanted to do with the energy I'd brought back. I said I wanted to stop living the life I'd planned with Garrett and start building one of my own design. 2 months after returning from Rome, I quit my job. I'd found a position with a nonprofit that worked on environmental advocacy, paying 30% less than my corporate salary, but offering something money couldn't buy, the feeling that my work actually mattered. The transition was terrifying and exhilarating, requiring me to move to a smaller apartment and adjust my expectations about what success looked like. Nadia said she was proud of me for taking the risk. My mother said she was worried but supported whatever made me happy. Dr. Okonkwo said career changes were often part of post-trauma growth, a way of reclaiming agency over a life that had felt out of control. I threw myself into the new job with energy I didn't know I had, working late on campaigns and weekends on strategy documents and finding purpose in the exhaustion. Garrett's shadow started to fade, replaced by something that felt more substantially mine. Dominic and I stayed in touch after Rome, texting regularly and talking on the phone every few weeks. He ended up moving to Portland, taking a job with an architecture firm that let him work on sustainable housing projects, the kind of meaningful work he'd always wanted but never pursued. We visited each other a few times, exploring our respective new cities together, building something that wasn't quite romance but was definitely more than friendship. I didn't know what to call it and decided I didn't need to label everything anymore. We understood each other in ways that came from shared experience, from having been hurt by people we loved and finding our way back to ourselves. When he held my hand at a coffee shop in Portland 6 months after our Rome trip, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, even though I never would have predicted ending up here when I found that sonogram in Garrett's jacket pocket. I heard through the grapevine that Garrett's life hadn't turned out the way he expected. Melody had the baby, but their relationship fell apart within months of the birth, crumbling under the weight of reality after the fantasy of their affair dissolved. Apparently, being parents was harder than sneaking around, and the foundation of betrayal they'd built on wasn't strong enough to support an actual life together. Garrett's parents were involved in a custody dispute. His career had stalled after colleagues lost respect for his integrity, and the picture-perfect future he'd sacrificed our relationship for had turned out to be a mirage. I didn't feel happy about his misfortune exactly, but I didn't feel sorry for him either. His choices had consequences, and those consequences had nothing to do with me anymore. I was building something real with someone who showed up and stayed, who never made me question my own perceptions, who understood that trust had to be earned through consistency rather than demanded through manipulation. The sapphire ring from Rome still sits on my right hand every day, a reminder of the moment I started choosing myself. Dominic jokes that I should let him replace it with something nicer, but I always refuse because the ring isn't about the stone or the setting. It's about standing in a dusty shop in a foreign city and deciding I deserved something that fit, something chosen by me and for me, something that represented who I was becoming rather than who someone else wanted me to be. The ring is a little scratched now from daily wear, and the band has developed a patina that the jeweler probably wouldn't approve of, but I love it more for the imperfections. It looks like it's been on an adventure. It looks like it belongs to someone who's lived. 3 years ago, I thought my life was on track because I had a handsome fiancé and a nice apartment and an engagement ring that sparkled under restaurant lights. Now I know that none of those things meant what I thought they meant. The track I was on led somewhere I never wanted to go, and getting derailed was the best thing that ever happened to me. 1 year after Rome, I married Dominic in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Oregon, surrounded by the friends and family who'd supported us through our respective heartbreaks. My mother cried happy tears for the second time in my life, but this time I knew they were warranted. Nadia gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then cry and then laugh again. Dr. Okonkwo sent a card saying she was proud of me for doing the work and finding the joy on the other side. I wore a simple dress and carried wildflowers and felt more beautiful than I ever had in the designer gown Garrett had wanted me to wear for our planned wedding. Dominic looked at me like I was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and I knew he meant it because I'd spent enough time with liars to recognize the truth when I finally found it. After the ceremony, he pulled me aside and said he'd been waiting for me since the first family dinner where I made his grandmother laugh, that he'd resigned himself to watching me marry his cousin until the universe intervened. I told him the universe had help from a sonogram and a plane ticket. He said he'd take it. Garrett sent a message after he heard about the wedding, one final attempt to insert himself into a story he was no longer part of. He said he was happy for us, which was obviously a lie, and that he hoped we'd find what we were looking for, which was obviously passive-aggressive. He said Melody and he were working on their co-parenting relationship, and that their daughter was beautiful, which was probably true but also felt like a way of reminding me what he'd chosen over me. I didn't respond because there was nothing left to say. I'd spent 3 years listening to his voice, believing his words, building my life around his plans, and I was done giving him space in my head. Dominic saw the message over my shoulder and asked if I wanted to talk about it. I deleted the message and kissed him and said there was nothing to talk about. Some chapters don't need an epilogue. Some endings are enough on their own. It's been 2 years now since I found that sonogram, and I sometimes have trouble remembering what my life felt like before everything changed. The apartment Garrett and I shared, the engagement ring he gave me, the future we planned together, all of it feels like it happened to someone else, a version of me who doesn't exist anymore. I'm grateful to that version for surviving long enough to become who I am now, but I don't miss her. She was so busy trying to be what Garrett wanted that she forgot to want anything for herself. She was so focused on holding the relationship together that she didn't notice it was already broken. She was so afraid of being alone that she accepted treatment no one should accept from someone who claimed to love them. I'm not that person anymore. I'm someone who buys her own jewelry and takes trips to places that interest her and works at a job that matters and loves a man who shows up every single day without being asked. Last month, I ran into Melody at a conference downtown. We were both there for work purposes, she for some corporate client, me for my nonprofit's advocacy campaign. I saw her across the room and felt my stomach clench reflexively, bracing for impact. But when our eyes met, something unexpected happened. She looked away first. She looked tired and smaller than I remembered, like the confidence that once seemed so effortless had been worn down by the reality of raising a child with a man who couldn't commit to anyone. I didn't approach her, and she didn't approach me. We moved through the conference in separate orbits, carefully avoiding collision, and when it was over, I walked out into the sunlight and felt nothing but relief. She had won the prize she'd been competing for, and it turned out not to be worth winning at all. Meanwhile, I'd lost the competition and found something so much better waiting in the wreckage. Sometimes the best revenge is becoming someone who doesn't need revenge anymore. Dominic is cooking dinner in our kitchen right now while I write this. Some complicated pasta recipe his grandmother taught him that requires ingredients I can't pronounce. The house we bought together 6 months ago is slowly becoming a home, filled with art we chose together and furniture that actually fits, and books stacked in corners because we never have enough shelves. I can hear him singing off-key to whatever playlist he has going, and I can smell garlic and tomatoes and something else I can't identify, but know I'm going to love. The sapphire ring catches the light as I type, still on my right hand after all this time, still reminding me of the moment everything changed. I thought finding that sonogram was the worst thing that could happen to me, and in some ways, it was. It destroyed a life I'd spent 3 years building and forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for longer than that. But it also freed me from a future that would have made me smaller, from a partner who would have kept me doubting myself forever, from a version of happiness that was really just the absence of conflict. The worst moment of my life led to the best one. I wouldn't change a thing. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.